All right, so today we're going deep on like the roots of governments.
Yeah.
Like, where do democracies come from? Dictatorships. Why do some countries, go back and forth?
Right.
And to get into all this, we're going to be looking at the work of Daron Acemoglu.
Yeah, Acemoglu and his colleagues have done some really fascinating work in this area.
And it's a lot, so
It is.
buckle up, everyone.
Yeah.
But by the end of this, I think we'll have like a much more solid understanding of why the political map of the world looks the way it does,
Yeah, like why some countries are stable democracies, others are, constantly kind of on the verge of collapse, and others just never seem to democratize.
Right. And one of the things we'll see is that like revolution, the threat of revolution is actually like a huge driver of change.
Absolutely.
So to start with like big picture, Acemoglu lays out like four main paths.
Yeah, 4 paths of political development.
Right.
And the first is kind of like the classic story, right? Gradual, stable transition to democracy. And, the example that always comes to mind is Britain.
Right.
Once they get on the path to democracy, their institutions tend to consolidate and, they become stronger over time.
Okay, so that's path one, a nice smooth road to democracy.
Right.
But path two is like bumpier.
Yeah, much bumpier.
It's like you get to democracy,
You get there.
but then it falls apart.
It collapses.
And then maybe it comes back, and then it falls apart again.
Cycles of democratization and collapse.
Exactly. And the example that really jumps out here is Argentina in the 20th century.
Yeah, it's like a case study in democratic fragility almost.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because, like, in 1912, they introduced universal male suffrage, right, under President Sanz Peña.
Right.
And the idea was to, like, bring in the traditional elites.
Into the fold.
Right? Like, create a more inclusive system. But it kind of backfired.
It did.
Because the expectation was that these old conservative groups would, like, adapt and, like, form a strong political party.
Right. Create a unified front.
But they just completely failed to unite.
They did. And this is a key point that Acemoglu highlights.
Yeah.
This failure to create a unified conservative party created a vacuum that was filled by
The radical
party.
Yeah.
And they really rose to prominence.
They did. They really challenged the established order.
They did. And by 1928, the conservative vote share had actually declined significantly.
Yeah, and all this like instability, this threat to the old power structure, it really destabilized Argentine democracy.
It made it very fragile.
Yeah. Okay, so we have the smooth path to democracy. We have the bumpy road to democracy. Now path 3 is like something totally different.
Yeah, this is where democracy doesn't really happen.
Right, or it happens much later.
Much later.
And it's not always about conflict or anything like that sometimes. It's because a society is doing pretty well under a non-democratic regime.
Yeah.
And the example that they give is Singapore.
Yes, Singapore is a really interesting case. There isn't a strong push for democratization because people are relatively content with their economic situation.
Right. They're like, why rock the boat?
Exactly. And what's really striking about Singapore is how intentionally the People's Action Party,
the PAP,
right, pursued this really aggressive strategy of industrialization.
Right from the get-go.
Yeah, right from the start. And a key part of this strategy was really managing the trade union movement.
Yeah.
So starting in the late 1950s and going into the late 1960s, they basically bring all these unions under this umbrella organization called the National Trade Union Congress.
Right.
Which is controlled by the government.
So not exactly independent unions then?
No, not really. And they even banned strikes.
Wow.
So, very top-down approach.
Yeah.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing even within the PAP.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in 1961, there was a split in the party.
Okay.
And this led to the formation of a new party called the Barisan Socialis.
The Barisan Socialis.
But the BAP, they hung on to power. And over time, they really extended their control over society.
In what ways?
Well, one of the key ways was through control of the media.
Yeah.
The sources we looked at make it clear that there are significant risks associated with political activism in Singapore.
Like if you speak out against the government.
Yeah, you could face serious consequences.
So it's not just about economic success, it's also about controlling information.
Absolutely.
And it's not just about the media either, right? The electoral system itself is structured in a way that benefits the PAP.
Right. They use a system that's often described as gerrymandering.
Gerrymandering.
And one of the ways they do this is through these group representation constituencies.
Okay, what are those?
So basically, these are larger electoral districts where you have multiple seats up for grabs.
Okay.
And parties will field teams of candidates. And the way these districts are drawn can really give the ruling party a huge advantage.
Even if they don't win the popular vote overall. Okay, so Singapore is like stable non-democracy because of a combination of economic success and careful political control.
Right.
Now, path 4 is kind of the flip side of that.
Yeah, this is non-democracy that persists because of high levels of inequality and exploitation.
Right.
And in these cases, any talk of democracy is seen as a direct threat to the elites.
Right, the elites. Yeah, because they're benefiting from the current system.
Exactly. And this really highlights the fundamental difference between non-democracy and democracy in terms of who benefits.
Right.
Non-democracy tends to serve the interests of a small group of elites and the privileged.
Yeah.
While democracy is more likely to produce policies that benefit the majority of the population.
So it's about political equality.
It is at its core.
Right.
Even in democracies, there isn't always perfect political equality.
Right.
Some voices are louder than others. Some interests have more influence.
Of course.
But democracy shifts the balance of power away from a small ruling clique.
Yeah.
And that's a huge difference.
Yeah, so if you're part of like a tiny, super rich elite in a country with a lot of poverty,
Right.
democracy is going to seem pretty scary.
But the idea of one person, one vote would be very threatening.
Okay, so we've got these 4 paths, and one of the things that really shapes which path a country takes is inequality.
Yeah, the level of economic inequality is a huge factor.
So walk us through that. Like, how does inequality affect the likelihood of democratization?
Okay, so basically the more unequal a society is, the more likely it is to be non-democratic.
Okay, that makes sense.
And there are kind of different levels to this.
Okay.
So at very low levels of inequality, like we see in Singapore, there might not be a strong push for democracy.
Because everyone's doing relatively okay.
Exactly.
Right.
Now, as inequality increases, you might see transitions to democracy.
Okay.
But those democracies might be unstable.
Like Argentina.
Exactly like Argentina.
Okay.
And then at very high levels of inequality, the elites might be so resistant to change that they'll resort to repression to prevent democracy from happening.
So it's like a spectrum.
It is a spectrum of inequality and,
Yeah.
and the corresponding political outcomes.
Okay, now Acemoglu and his colleagues, they approach this from a very economic perspective, right?
They're economists.
Right. It's not just about like abstract ideals of freedom or democracy.
Right.
It's about people making rational decisions based on their economic interests.
Right. And the idea is that people have preferences not just for material wealth,
Right.
but for things like stability, security, fairness.
Yeah.
And they'll choose a political system based on how they think it will affect their overall well-being.
Right.
So this leads to strategic interactions between different groups.
Like the elites and the citizens.
Right.
Yeah.
And these interactions can be analyzed using game theory.
Game theory.
Yeah, it's a way to analyze how people make decisions when they're anticipating each other's moves.
Like a game of chess.
Exactly.
Okay, so game theory for politics.
Right.
So, cool.
And it can really help us understand why elites might choose to repress or concede and why citizens might choose to protest or even revolt.
So it's all about strategy and anticipating consequences.
Exactly.
Okay, now one of the really interesting ideas is this concept of the transitory nature of de facto political power.
Right.
What does that even mean?
So this is the idea that even in non-democracies, citizens have a certain amount of power.
Okay.
Not legal power, but power in practice.
Like what kind of power?
The power to cause disruption,
Disruption.
to protest, to threaten revolution.
Ah.
Think about historical events like the Paris Commune or the Russian Revolution.
Uprisings.
Exactly. Those are examples of de facto power.
So even without the right to vote, people can still exert influence.
Yes. But this power is inherently unstable.
And stable.
That's the transitory part.
Right.
It's incredibly difficult to sustain a revolution or even like a prolonged protest movement.
Yeah, it takes a lot of organization and commitment.
It does, and there's always the risk of the elites cracking down.
So because this de facto power is so unstable, the people have a strong incentive to try and like lock it in.
Exactly.
And how do they do that?
By pushing for institutional change.
Institutional change, like
democratization.
democracy.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so they're basically saying, we've got your attention now,
Right.
but we need to change the rules of the game so that we have a voice even when we're not in the streets.
Exactly.
And that brings us back to that idea of revolution as a driver of change.
Yeah. The threat of revolution is often what forces elites to make concessions.
And we see this all over history, right?
All over history.
The Reform Acts in Britain.
Right. Those were driven by popular pressure and the fear of revolution.
Yeah, and in Argentina, the introduction of universal male suffrage in 1912, that was influenced by social unrest and the radicalization of urban workers.
Exactly.
And even in Colombia in 1936, universal suffrage was partly a response to social unrest. So it's not like the elites just suddenly had a change of heart. They made concessions because they were afraid of losing their power.
Exactly. They were responding to a threat.
Okay, so how do elites respond to this threat of democratization?
Well, they have a few options.
Okay.
One option is repression.
Repression, just crack down on dissent.
Right. Use force and other means to suppress any opposition.
And this is more likely if the elite's wealth is tied up in land, right?
Right, because land is easy to tax under a democracy.
Yeah.
And social unrest might not be as damaging to land as it would be to, say, factories or financial assets.
Okay.
And historically, agrarian societies have often relied on very repressive labor systems.
Like slavery or serfdom.
Exactly. And democracy would likely abolish those systems.
So that helps explain why so many revolutions have happened in agrarian societies. Now, if the elite's wealth is more mobile, like capital or human capital,
Right.
they might be less likely to choose repression.
Right, because they need a stable economy.
Yeah. So what are their other options?
Well, they could make concessions.
Concessions?
Redistribute some wealth.
Okay.
Try to appease the people.
To prevent a bigger uprising.
Right.
Okay.
Another option is to try and shape the emerging democratic institutions.
Shape them in a way that protects their interests.
Exactly, like trying to rig the game even as they're being forced to play it.
Okay. And are there any examples of this?
Yeah, there are a few. Pinochet's constitution in Chile
Right.
that was designed to limit the power of future left-wing governments.
Okay.
And the concessions made by the ANC in South Africa.
Right.
Those were aimed at protecting the interests of the white minority.
So it's all about trying to maintain some degree of control, even as you're losing power.
Exactly.
Now, another key player in all this is the middle class.
Yeah, the middle class can be a real driving force for democratization.
In what way?
Well, they often lead or participate in revolutionary movements.
Okay.
Think about Britain's First Reform Act,
Yeah.
the Paris Commune, the Radical Party revolts in Argentina.
Right.
These all had significant middle-class involvement.
So they're not the poorest, but they're not the elites either.
Right. They have their own distinct interests.
Okay. And once democracy is established, what role does the middle class play?
They can help to consolidate it
Consolidated how?
by acting as a buffer between the rich and the poor,
Okay.
which can limit the pressure for radical redistribution.
And make democracy less threatening to the elites.
Exactly.
Okay.
And we see this in countries like Costa Rica and Colombia, which have large middle classes.
Right.
And have relatively stable democracies.
Okay.
Compared to countries like Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua,
Right.
where the middle class is much smaller and democracy has been more fragile.
So a strong middle class is good for democracy.
Yeah, it tends to promote stability.
Okay, now we can't talk about all this without talking about globalization.
Right. Globalization has a huge impact on all these dynamics.
So how does it affect democratization?
Well, it's complicated.
Of course it is.
But in general, in countries that have a lot of labor but not a lot of capital, increased trade can actually reduce inequality
How so?
because it increases demand for labor,
Yeah.
which drives up wages.
Okay.
And that can make democracy less threatening to the elites.
Because the gap between the rich and the poor shrinks.
Right.
Okay, but it's not always that simple, right?
No. In countries that are abundant in land but have high inequality.
Like some Latin American countries before World War I.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Globalization actually increased the returns to land ownership.
Which benefited the elites.
Right, and that could hinder democratization.
Okay.
But globalization can also make repression more costly
How so?
because it makes economic disruption more costly for everyone.
Okay.
And it can also lead to international pressure and sanctions.
So it's a mixed bag.
It is a mixed bag.
Now, what about political identities?
Yeah, political identities also matter.
How so?
Well, the nature of political identities can influence the kind of democracy that emerges.
Okay.
So in societies where identities are mostly based on class.
Like rich versus poor.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You might see more pressure for radical redistribution.
Okay.
But in societies with lots of cross-cutting cleavages,
Cleavage is
like race, ethnicity, religion, region,
Okay.
you might see less pressure for redistribution.
Why is that?
Because it's harder to form broad coalitions based solely on class,
Okay.
and this can make democracy more stable.
Because the elites aren't as afraid of being completely overthrown.
Right.
Okay, so diversity can actually be good for democracy.
Yeah, in some cases it can.
Interesting.
Now, even stable democracies can be fragile.
Right.
And one of the biggest threats to democracy is economic crisis.
Yeah.
Economic and political crises can destabilize any regime.
Right.
But a lot of democratic collapses have happened during or after economic downturns.
Like the coup against Allende in Chile.
Exactly.
Okay.
But crises can also create opportunities for redemocratization.
Like in Venezuela in 1958.
Right.
So it's a two-way street.
It is.
Now, what about the relationship between democratization and redistribution?
Yeah, so does democracy lead to more equality?
Right.
Well, often it does.
Okay.
Historically, democratization has often led to increased redistribution
Okay.
and policies that favor the previously disenfranchised.
Okay. Are there any examples of this?
Yeah, tons. The expansion of the welfare state in Britain,
Right.
the social and labor reforms in Germany's Weimar Republic,
Mm-hmm.
the increase in wages in Sweden after 1920,
Okay.
even in Argentina under Irigoyen and Perón, there were significant redistributive policies.
Okay.
And on the flip side, coups have sometimes been motivated by a desire to reverse those policies.
To stop redistribution.
Exactly.
Okay.
But it's important to note that the relationship between overall inequality and redistribution in democracies is not always clear-cut.
It's complicated.
It is.
Now, one of the key arguments is this idea of a commitment problem.
Right.
So the elites might make promises to avoid a revolution.
Yeah. They might try to appease the people.
Right.
But why should anyone believe them?
Exactly.
That's the commitment problem.
Yeah, in a non-democracy, the elites don't really have to keep their promises.
Right. There's no mechanism to hold them accountable.
So once the threat is gone, they can go back on their word.
Exactly.
Okay.
But democracy changes that
How?
because it creates institutions that give citizens real power.
Oh, okay.
And that makes promises more credible.
So democracy is a way to lock in those promises.
Exactly.
And are there any historical examples of this commitment problem?
Oh, yeah. Tons.
Okay, like what?
Well, the English peasants' revolt in the 14th century,
Okay, what happened there?
King Richard II made all these promises to the peasants to get them to stop rebelling.
Yeah.
But once the threat was over, he broke those promises.
Of course he did.
Yeah. And then there's the Comunero Rebellion in New Granada in the 18th century.
What happened there?
Same thing. The royal government made promises to quell the rebellion and then went back on their word.
Executed the leaders.
Right.
Brutal.
And even the Russian Revolution of 1905,
Yeah.
Tsar Nicholas II issued the October Manifesto, promising reforms and a more representative government, but he didn't really follow through.
Right, so promises without a real shift in power are pretty worthless.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's try to summarize all this. Like, what's the basic model of democratization?
Okay, so in the simplest terms, democratization happens when the threat of revolution is credible,
Okay.
and the elites decide that it's less costly to concede power than to risk a revolution.
Right.
And two key factors here are the cost of revolution and the level of inequality.
Okay, now this is interesting. The relationship between inequality and democratization is not linear.
Right, it's not a straight line.
Yeah.
Democratization is actually most likely at intermediate levels of inequality.
That's counterintuitive.
It is.
Why is that?
Well, at very low levels of inequality, there might not be enough discontent to spark a revolution.
People are relatively happy.
Right. And at very high levels of inequality, the elites might be willing to use extreme repression to hold on to power.
They have so much to lose.
Exactly.
So it's that middle ground where the threat of revolution is real, but the elites aren't yet willing to go all out to suppress it.
Right.
That's where democracy is most likely to emerge.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about how democracies emerge, but what about staying democratic?
Right. How do democracies consolidate?
Yeah.
So democratic consolidation is about understanding why some democracies survive while others collapse.
Okay.
And a few things are really important here.
Okay, like what?
Well, economic crises are bad for democracy.
Yeah, they create instability.
Right.
And they can erode trust in institutions.
Exactly.
Okay, what else? High inequality is also bad for democracy.
Makes coups more likely.
Right, because the elites are more afraid of redistribution.
Okay.
And even targeted redistribution can be a problem.
How so?
Because it can make democracy seem less beneficial to the elites who are excluded.
Okay, so if you're going to redistribute, you have to be careful.
Right.
Okay, what else?
There's also some evidence that presidential systems are less durable than parliamentary systems. Interesting, why is that?
Well, presidential systems have this winner-take-all dynamic,
Right.
and that can make them more vulnerable to coups.
Okay, so If you want a stable democracy, you need to manage the economy, keep inequality in check,
Right.
and maybe choose a parliamentary system.
Possibly.
Okay, now let's add another layer here. The three-class model.
Okay, so we've got the rich, the middle class, and the poor.
Right.
And the presence of a middle class can really change things.
How so?
Well, it creates the possibility of partial democracy.
Partial democracy, what's that?
That's where only the elites and the middle class have political rights.
Okay.
And this can happen as a way to divide the middle class and the poor.
To prevent them from uniting against the elites.
Exactly.
Okay.
And sometimes competition between the elites and the middle class can lead to an expansion of rights.
As one group tries to outbid the other.
Right.
Okay.
But the threat of revolution from the poor is always there.
So even in a partial democracy, the elites have to be careful, and a large middle class can help to consolidate democracy.
Yeah, by moderating demands for redistribution.
And making the system less threatening to the elites.
Exactly.
Okay, so the middle class is important.
Very important.
Now let's go back to the economic structure.
Okay.
How does that shape political preferences?
Well, the way income is distributed between labor capital and land can really affect who supports democracy.
Okay.
So landowners, as we said before, are often opposed to democracy.
Because they're afraid of being taxed.
Right.
Okay.
And they might also depend on systems of labor control that democracy would abolish.
Okay. And we see this in Central America, right?
Yeah. Costa Rica, with its smallholder agriculture, has had a stable democracy.
Right.
While Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador, with their large landed estates, have had more trouble.
Okay.
And human capital is also interesting.
Yeah.
It's hard to tax and redistribute human capital.
So democracies in human capital-rich societies might be less redistributive.
Right.
Okay, now let's touch on globalization one last time. How do things like trade and financial integration affect all this?
Well, in labor-abundant countries, trade can reduce inequality.
By increasing wages.
Right.
Okay.
And that can make democracy more likely,
And financial integration can make democracy less redistributive.
which can reduce the incentive for coups.
So globalization can have both positive and negative effects.
It can.
Okay, now let's look at a few specific cases.
Okay.
Britain, Singapore, South Africa.
Right. Fine.
So Britain, their path to democracy fits the model of rising popular power,
Right. Driven by economic changes and inequality.
which forced the elites to make concessions.
Exactly.
Singapore is a case of stable non-democracy due to relative equality and prosperity.
Yeah, achieved through deliberate policies.
And tight control.
Right.
But as Singapore continues to develop,
Yeah.
the PAP might eventually find repression too costly.
And that could lead to democratization.
Interesting.
South Africa's delayed democracy was a result of extreme inequality,
Right.
rooted in its history as a settler colony.
And the system of apartheid?
Yeah. Repression was cheap and effective for a long time.
But eventually, the costs of maintaining apartheid became too high.
And South Africa democratized.
Okay, so those are just a few examples of how these dynamics play out in the real world.
Right.
So as we wrap up here, what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that economics and politics are deeply intertwined.
Yeah, you can't understand one without the other.
Right.
And the threat of revolution is a powerful driver of change,
Absolutely.
even if it never actually happens.
Even if it's just a threat.
Right.
And the specific economic structure of a society really matters.
Yeah, whether it's based on land, labor capital.
It all shapes the political landscape.
Okay, so what's one big question that our listeners should think about?
Well, given all these factors,
Yeah, all this complexity.
what does the future hold for countries with high inequality
Right.
or for countries with fragile democracies?
Yeah. And how will the design of their institutions affect their trajectory?
Right? Will their institutions help them to consolidate democracy?
Or will they make things worse?
Exactly.
Big questions.
Huge questions.
And we've only scratched the surface here.
We have.
So keep learning.
Keep exploring.
Read more about these topics.
Yeah. Dive deeper into the cases we discussed.
And think critically about the world around you.
Exactly.
Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.